A slideshow appears under a video call.
I see it is right at 1 o'clock. So there's still a few people joining us, but my name is Jeff Horan. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and it's going to start in just a second. So with that, though, so you're here for the 6th installment of our 12-part series, Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series. And today you're going to be hearing from Randy Wilson of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's going to be talking about stand level management, desired forest conditions, structure, and composition. And to give us some information on logistics is Shannon Connors, who's here from our National Conservation Training Center and provides us all our technical support. So go ahead and take it away, Shannon, and tell us a little bit about what's happening next.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome everybody. So I'm just going to go over a few logistical details here.
Slide.
The Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center, Forest Ecology Working Group, and Migratory Bird Program. We will share this contact information in the chat box if you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group, or if you'd like to receive continuing education credits for these webinars.
Slide. Disclaimer.
And just a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement.
Slide.
Hey, thank you, Shannon. And as Shannon said, my name is Jeff Horan. I'm a forest ecologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Refuge Program. And I'm also with our Forest Ecology Working Group, which works with partners to create this 12-part webinar series. I'll be moderating today's webinar and also monitoring the chat along with Shannon. So thank you to Shannon Connors, to our speaker, Randy Wilson, and also to Jim Siegel of NCTC and our Forest Bird team for their great assistance throughout this series. The 12-part Forest for the Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Forest Ecology Working Group, the National Conservation Training Center, and the Migratory Birds Program. The purpose of our webinar series and the Forest Ecology Working Group is to increase the understanding and integration of forest ecology, applied science, and habitat management principles within the Fish and Wildlife Service, but also with our partners. The Migratory Birds Program is pleased to be co-sponsoring this webinar series as part of the Partners in Flight celebration of 30 years of conservation, but also the sobering recognition of the documented loss of some 3 billion birds over the last 50 years. So there's lots of conservation work still to be done, and this webinar series is part of that roadmap to recovery of forest birds. So if you have questions about this series, my contact information is on the webinar flyer. And then if you are interested in Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters continuing education credits, you can contact Jim Siegel, whose name is and contact information is also on the flyers. So before I introduce Randy, I want to talk about just a few more things. The things I want to talk about is we are going to try to engage you, the participants, and so we're willing to take a few questions. We'll do that at least once in the middle of the presentation, and then also at the end. So you can enter your questions into the chat at any time, and we'll try to answer. Randy will try to answer this briefly, and the ones we can't answer, we will try to answer. Randy will go back and take a shot at answering later, and then come back. We'll send those back out to you. I also wanted to mention that Randy also helped us with a 6-minute video called Desired Forest Conditions for Bottomland Hardwood Forests in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. Some of you who saw our webinar 4 with Bob Ford saw that at the end of the series, at the end of the webinar. But it's also on our website in our gallery, so you can grab that. And the last thing before I introduce Randy, I wanted to just give folks a heads up for our webinar 7, and that's going to be on September 21st. And we're always at 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. So the Forestry for the Birds in this case, it's forestry for the birds. So we're talking about conservation that's happening on the landscape, and that's going to be Amanda Mahaffey from the Forest Stewards Guild. So now, to introduce Randy Wilson.
Slide.
Randy received his Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Management from Tennessee Technological University and his master's degree in ecology from the University of Memphis. Randy currently serves as the station leader for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Migratory Bird Field Station, and that's located in Jackson, Mississippi, where he facilitates research and monitoring to reduce uncertainty about management decisions and provides technical assistance to conservation partners on a variety of bird-related issues. Prior to his current position, Randy served as science coordinator for the Lower Mississippi Valley joint venture, overseeing design and implementation of bird conservation plans for the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and the West Gulf Coast Plain geographies. Prior to joining the service, Randy worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, where he was at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, conducting research investigations on bird response to forest management and restoration activities in bottomland hardwood forests across the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. So again, that's going to sound pretty familiar because that's what we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Randy to talk about stand level management, desired forest conditions, structure, and composition. Again, thanks to everyone who's joining us today. Take it away, Randy. Thank you.
Slide.
All right, thank you, Jeff, for that intro. So with that intro, so the topic today is stand level management for trying to bring back our forest birds. How do we do that? And so kind of set the tone for that, I wanted to talk about a little bit of background context first. And I broke the talk up into kind of three main points, and a little bit of the philosophy, kind of changing paradigms in bird conservation, and then go into like a case study using forested wetlands in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, talk briefly about desired forest conditions in southern pine systems, and then kind of conclude with kind of the impetus for some research and monitoring and how that informs management going forward.
Slide, a timeline.
So kind of jumping right into it, the shifting paradigms, I won't go into each one of these, but over the last 100+ years, you can see that the conservation paradigm is going through several kind of large shifts, if you will. Early 1900s, it was the wise use era. I call it the non-wise use era. That was, the old days of whack and stack, and here we go, cut everything down. We moved out of that into restoration and recovery. Fast forward up through most people was familiar with ecosystem management is kind of the paradigm of the day. But I would suggest that the new paradigm is one of population sustainability. And we'll talk about that here in just a second in more detail.
Slide.
So ecosystem-based approach was a major shift in our conservation kind of mindset, and it got us out of the resource-based, opportunistic pursuit of conservation. And it made us think about everything together, fish and birds and water, and bringing in stakeholders to the table to think through these exercises. But more recently, the conservation communities kind of realized that this ecosystem-based approach requires yet again kind of a fundamental change or twist to it, and that we need to be thinking more about our trust resources in that business model of how do we benefit birds, and we do that through linking those to strategic planning processes. That the outcome is population sustainability. So before, in ecosystem approach, it was more of a sustainable landscape, and what does that mean? And so here we're really bringing it home to population sustainability, thinking about our trust resources.
Slide.
And we see this embedded in the Partners in Flight National Plan, where the target is landscapes capable of sustaining populations at range-wide levels. And it's through the application of different biological models that link our population goals to our habitat objectives at multiple spatial scales. So this shouldn't be too much of a surprise for most folks that's kind of paid attention or is living in the Partners in Flight arena.
Slide.
So bringing it down to the actual crux of the matter, so how do we manage for population sustainability? That's kind of the question we're going to try to unravel here today.
Slide.
So the first thing I would submit is we need to think about population sustainability as a function of both landscape quality and site quality. So we've seen a couple of the previous presenters talk about landscape context and landscape quality, block size, configuration, etc. Then we also need to think about the site quality at the stand level. What does it look like? What's the composition structure associated with those specific sites on the ground?
slide,
If we think about it in that context, then all of it collectively has implications to our restoration and management strategies.
slide,
So I won't spend much time here. I think Bob Ford did a pretty good job of talking about like some of the landscape modeling efforts that's undergone. In the simplest terms, it's like a patch size model where it's the area of forest required to support X number of birds or breeding pairs.
slide,
And so those sorts of models then can be fed into larger decision support tools that allow us to figure out where exactly on the landscape we should be implementing our restoration activities to build larger patches of woods, sorry. And in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, just as a frame of reference, we're over 1 million acres of restored habitat. And a lot of that is gone in those core areas to build larger blocks of forest to benefit forest breeding birds, as well as the now delisted Louisiana black bear.
slide,
So how do we manage for site quality? A banner in my way here. Hold on. Move that. So how do we manage for site quality to support population sustainability? You know, that's really the question a lot of the foresters are asking. So in the old days, it was the forestry community was managing forest, and us biologists where we're left to track numbers and manage birds. We quickly realized that to manage bird populations, we need the foresters at the table as well. So that's going to be a reoccurring theme through this talk.
slide,
And so the term desired forest conditions was put on the table. I don't know if that's the best phrase to use, but it's kind of what we're using. It's the desired forest conditions for wildlife, or in this case, for breeding birds, what we're kind of talking about. So why define these? We have a long history of forest management. We've been cutting trees for a long time. You know, nearly everybody's got best management practices in play. But if you really stop and think about it, most of these management scenarios, there is no clearly defined relationship between our management actions or our practices and population sustainability. So again, the biological community has not done a really good job of talking with the forestry community to make those relationships.
slide,
And so to kind of reinforce that, so designing, you know, a house, I mean, I recently built a house a few years ago. I would not have let my contractor just build a house without a blueprint, right? So how are foresters supposed to build a house for our, you know, our forest breeding bird community without some sort of blueprint?
slide,
And then digging a little deeper into that, if we can do that, we can identify some explicit linkages between wildlife and our birds or our habitat metrics. And I said wildlife here because this is primarily a bird-centric talk, but we should not lose sight of the other wildlife species that are, you know, using these forest conditions to meet their own resource needs. And it also provides a basis for research and monitoring, you know, the adaptive management model. You know, we're going to implement something, we're going to monitor it and use that information to do better in the future.
slide,
And so a recent paper by Casey Lott et al. Kind of highlights, you know, or reinforces a couple of things that, you know, I want to leave you with. And that what they found was that forest managers are desiring descriptions of wildlife species, vegetation relationships, using the operational metrics, you know, surrounding forest management. Things of forest types, composition, basal area, tree density. Us as birders, and I'm guilty of it, you know, when I was doing research, we measured minutia, you know, how far a nest was out on the limb, etc. It's hard to translate into forest management prescriptions, you know, from the forestry perspective. And then the second key point was, you know, these managers are desiring information, you know, but for wildlife habitats, you know, for different species across those different ecological processes or successional gradients. So it's not just information for red-cockaded woodpeckers, but it's for the black pine snake and Bachman's sparrow and everything else that's associated in that same habitat community.
new text appears on slide,
And so I would submit that the desired forest conditions that we'll talk about here in a minute provides a really nice foundation by which we can do all of that, which is being asked of us by our forest managers.
slide, graph,
So how do we get to desired forest conditions? And so think about your forest, there's all these different forest structural metrics, canopy cover, basal area, shrub cover, et cetera. We're familiar with those. And so you think about the species that you're worried about, or the priority birds in this case. So you look at a Kentucky warbler, it might fall out on the graph here. You add in Swainson's warbler, you know, Acadian flycatcher, And so somewhere there's an overlap, kind of quote unquote the sweet spot. Now, in reality, these overlaps are much greater in most cases. I just drew them all very nice and simple for demonstration purposes here. You get the point. So we're trying to figure out where the overlap are within these species guilds. And then before I move forward, there's always one outlier. And so typically we found that they kind of come out to be threatened and endangered or a species of special concern. And if you have that, then that's probably going to supersede, any other desired forest conditions you're going to be managing for that species. Or that sometimes are the overabundant birds that we may not, necessarily be worried about from a habitat perspective. Nevertheless, it's important to identify that so you as a forest manager know there's differences and disparate kind of species and needs out there. And so going through this process identifies that on the front end.
Slide 2 pictures.
All right, so I had a kind of a pause here for a question. Jeff, I think I'll just roll on and we'll take the questions at the next break point, if that's okay.
I think that's a good call, Randy. Keep on rolling.
All right.
Slide.
And so now what I want to transition into is kind of a case study looking at the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, where kind of the desired forest conditions were born, so to speak. And I'm going to apologize on the front end. I might use we, them, they. I'm not sure what pronoun to use or voice, because I was part of the activity that created these, but yet it was through a larger partnership. And then I'm the guy presenting here, so I'm not sure what pronoun I'm supposed to use. So excuse me if I get it out of context there.
Slide.
So looking at population sustainability, versus, landscape quality and site quality, here we're going to get into more of the site quality. And so the graphic there on the left is the book, the Desired Forest Conditions for Wildlife book, Restoration Management and Monitoring of Forest Resources. And then the joint venture partnership working through a partnership with NRCS has also built some additional tools to facilitate the restoration and the management of reforested areas. Remember, I spoke earlier about, over 1 million acres have been reforested. Well, a lot of that's coming online and requires management as well.
Slide, pictures of birds.
So the first thing we did was we thought about what are the priority birds within forested wetlands. There's a whole suite of priority forest songbirds. These are not a surprise to anyone.
Slide.
There's another set of additional priority species that we considered as well, thinking about bats and Louisiana black bear, reptiles, amphibians. Then there's a whole suite of game birds that we should be thinking about as well. The waterfowl community, the eastern wild turkey, woodcock, things that, the game species, they're right in there along with the swinks and warblers as well. So how do we manage all of this collectively?
Slide.
So the first step was to kind of undertake a literature review. The partnership went through the literature. There's several really good things available, from habitat suitability indexes to published literature, peer-reviewed stuff.
Slide.
Once we had that, what we were looking for was how do we relate birds to those metrics like canopy cover, basal area, and there is a lot of information available in both the peer-reviewed literature as well as the gray literature that will help us as managers think through these relationships.
Slide.
And then for some species like cerulean warbler, we know they like kind of a broken canopy or forest with what we call a dominant or super dominant tree kind of sticking out the top, creating that broken canopy. And then prothonotary, and woodpeckers and sort require a number of snags or dead, dying trees. We've tried to factor all of that into our thinking as well.
Slide.
Once we kind of had that, then we took that to the field, and this is where it really became a co-production sort of environment. It was the biologists right alongside the foresters talking about this. Here's what we think these birds and these wildlife species need. And the foresters would ask us, well, what does that look like? And we'd walk around in the woods till we found it, and we'd double check the basal areas and canopy cover values that we'd pulled from the literature to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page.
Slide.
And from that, we was able to create what we called the desired stand conditions. So there's two tables. The primary management factors would be table 1, canopy cover, mid-story, basal area, tree stocking. These are things that foresters think about every day as they're writing and thinking about their prescriptions. And we presented it in 2 primary columns. There's the desired condition, and I'll just use canopy cover as an example. 60 to 70% canopy cover. But then conditions that may warrant management, is greater than 80. We tried to think about the trigger point. What would cause a forester to want to implement a treatment to change the forest structure a little bit? So it's not only just providing that relationship, the 60 to 70% is good, but we tried to also provide those managers some basis to, as a trigger point, as I said, to kind of kick into management actions.
Slide, table.
Similarly, there's a secondary set of management factors, and here's where we get into kind of a species-specific kind of thing: dominant trees, understory cover, regeneration, coarse woody debris, cavities, etc. And again, you see the desired conditions, and then conditions that may warrant management. That trigger point for a forester to consider.
Slide.
And so, kind of zooming out a little bit, kind of give you a kind of a pictorial of what that looks like. What we're striving for is a forest that is, complex, multi-layered in nature. And this photo does a really nice job of capturing that. You can kind of see, kind of a tree fall gap or a canopy gap could have been created from a tree fall or actual silvicultural treatment, with larger trees and a dense understory.
Slide.
Within that stand, we should also be able to go find, a number of small cavities, large cavities, snags, down woody material, etc., such that we're meeting all the needs of these priority species.
Slide, picture of trees.
And then also, we should be able to find, oak regeneration within that area, because within bottomland hardwood forest, right, they're bottomland hardwood forest, and so it's a large oak comprised system. And so any of these treatments we're talking about have to be commercially viable. No one refuge or WMA has the manpower to do that on their own. And so the oak component is critical to perpetuate not only for wildlife species, but also to keep the commercial viability intact within these systems.
Slide, bullet point list.
Looking at the stand level management under these desired conditions, the take home we always try to present is there's no silver bullet. Everybody says, well, how do I manage for desired forest conditions? Well, I can't tell you, because every stand is different, right? And then every landowner has a slightly different objective. And that's even within landowners, like within the National Wildlife Refuge System, we generally all have the same end goal, but each refuge is slightly different. It's at a different position in the landscape, along the wetness gradient, etc. And the same holds true for the private lands arena as well. So the desired conditions are not a prescription within themselves. That was also kind of one of those misnomers early on. People thought we were writing a prescription for them. No, you as the forester, it's still up to you to draft the prescription. What we're doing is trying to set the tone, paint you a picture of what we desire. And here's some structural metrics that will benefit priority species. Now you figure out how to get there. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. And so those are basically just simply the metrics that relates birds to their structural habitat characteristics.
Slide.
So digging in a little bit deeper into that, into stand level management, kind of deviating from history or maybe from your forestry class you might have had in college, right? So here we're thinking there's no rotation or cutting cycle, rather it's an evaluation cycle. So every 10 to 15 years, kind of depends on the stand, might be 20 years. You evaluate it based off of the desired conditions, and then make a determination if it warrants additional treatments to move it closer to those desired conditions, as opposed to a rotational or a cutting cycle gets you into more of a commercial production atmosphere. But also, it might take multiple treatments to get there. No one stand is the same, right? So you might be able to get a large percentage of those desired conditions with one treatment in this stand, where a different stand, based off of previous management activities, it might take you a couple, 2 or 3 treatments to get it to where you want it for these desired conditions. The other key point here is that those primary management factors are intended to be an average across the stand. Again, early on when this was kind of first rolled out, some people thought we were implying that you had to have those metrics on every acre. That is not, in fact, the case. It's like actually probably be really difficult to actually do that. So on the average, the stand should, have the 60 to 70 canopy cover, etc. And that last bullet there, basically, all the silvicultural tools are available to the land manager. Again, because we're just going towards these structural characteristics. How do we get those PAs and canopy covers, etc. So it's up to you as the manager to kind of figure out, understand your system, your stand, and apply those tools to get us those structural metrics.
Slide, map of birds.
And so last month, Jeff Larkin reminded us that bird populations require a mosaic of habitat across the landscape. So how much of that do we need? And this was a question we got early on from our managers when we were going through the early stages of developing this. So I'm a manager on a refuge, and so, well, how much of that do you want or do you need, to support wildlife?
Slide.
And so the answer that we kind of came up with was looking within, a local landscape, and here we define that as like a 10,000 acre block. So basically, we're managing on the rule of thirds, in that within that 10,000 acres, on the average, a third of it should be within desired forest conditions. A third of it should be growing into desired conditions. So a point here is that you don't just cut to desired conditions. You probably need to cut below those to maximize the length of time that you have those good conditions. And then there's another third of the habitat or that landscape that warrants management. So kind of we're managing on this rotational basis, using the rule of thirds to guide us.
Slide, heat map.
All right, so jumping back, remember I said we've planted nearly 1 million acres or over 1 million acres of hardwoods in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley using our early planning from those landscape level metrics.
Slide, picture.
Fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, and we're seeing stands that look like this. So this is not a very wildlife friendly stand, right? It's kind of a oak monoculture, no understory, no grass cover. It is wildlife habitat, but we can do better.
Slide.
And so this is where that tri-state partnership within RCS, and the tri-states would be Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, have come together through the joint venture partnership to develop additional tools to guide managers in how do we assess and treat these reforested stands. And usually it's following the principles of the desired forest conditions and taking that from kind of more of a mature stand down to these early 20, 30-year-old plantations.
Slide, brief pause.
All right, so here I'm going to pause for a second. I know I covered a lot of ground pretty fast. I got a lot of ground to cover yet, but Jeff, I'll take a question if we have one here, and let me catch my breath.
Rule of thirds.
Oh, Jeff, you were on mute there for a second. If you could repeat that question.
Oh, so I'll back up. So Randy, how did you come up with your rule of thirds? That question came from Kevin.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking about that on my drive in this morning. I want to say it came without the refuge system, and I think it was from one of our early foresters. It's really just kind of a rule of thirds, a seat of the pants, because if you're a scientist and you try to really get into it and you go a quarter, and 66% and 33%, you can get yourself in a box really quick. There's really no data per se that kind of drives that answer. And so we thought about it and we looked at several stands within refuges and WMAs across the valley and talked to our local managers and just came to an agreement that the rule of thirds was a good benchmark. It's not to hold in, the holy grail. Nobody's going to call you bad if you do something different. But it's a weak link within the literature, and it's really hard to get a grasp on. So it's just kind of our best guess, expert opinion right now.
Okay, so there's some good questions in here that are popping in. I'm going to give you one more because I think it's a nice follow-on to what. So this is from Brenda. If you manage for those average conditions, don't you also need to set the maximum and minimum values per acre? So that kind of builds on from your rule of thirds. How do you nail it down?
Yeah, and so we could do that. And so if you go back and think about the table, so there's the desired conditions, thinking about the canopy cover, like 60 to 70%. So notice it was the desired conditions is a range, right? Because we weren't naive enough, maybe not the right word, to say it's 78%. Right? The more specific you get, the more trouble you get into, like somebody's going to hold you to that. So it's a range of values. And so in some way, the max and min, feeds into that. And so there's an upper end, that's kind of maybe the trigger point. Remember, that was 80% canopy cover would be the maximum that would be beneficial letting sunlight through. And then on the lower end, you'd have to look at some of the other metrics to determine like the lower end, thinking about, managing for clear cuts and large gap sizes. Once you go so far, then you let so much sunlight in, you're really changing the forest structure. So I'm kind of beating around the bush. This is one of those questions I'd really like to, sit down in person and talk about the min and max. It's a pretty complex, but it bleeds into a couple other arenas.
Yeah,
I think a shot at answering that one more after the math.
Yeah, and I think that questioner knows the complexity of that question. So at any rate, take it away, Randy. Keep on rolling. We'll have a chance for a couple more questions at the end. Thanks for you guys for putting them in.
Perfect. Thanks for that.
Slide.
Okay, so moving on. And so here's my so Bob Ford, after we kind of finished the desired forest conditions for forested wetlands, my good friend Bob Ford said, "Hey, Randy, can you do that for longleaf pine too? Sure would be nice, right? This is the time the longleaf partnership was kind of coming on board and everybody's really thinking about how do we restore the longleaf community." And I was dumb enough, naive enough, something to say yes to that question to Bob.
Slide.
And so I immediately kind of went to the Switch Joint Venture Partnerships and went to the East Gulf Coastal Plain Joint Venture Partnership, and who has that longleaf pine geography kind of under their purview. And we thought about it and we pulled together a partnership with NatureServe with funding through the old Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC. Some of y'all remember that from the Fish and Wildlife Service days. To pull together a project to look at southern pine systems across the Southeast.
Slide.
And so there are 7 or 8 kind of broad pine systems across the Southeast, kind of different colors displayed here on the map. All these have something in common in that they're all mostly open pine type systems with diverse ground cover, native warm season grasses and forbs. So they kind of have similar structure to them, although they're different communities.
Slide.
So we set out to think about how do we develop desired forest conditions for southern pines. And we used a similar type process. We went and got our list of priority species here. You can see there's a lot of birds, but then there's also the pine system, as you know, has a lot of T&E system species within that system. We tried to factor those in as well, such that we took a more of a holistic approach and we didn't have the bird model competing against a gopher tortoise or pine snake model. So
slide.
Again, the similar sort of thing, kind of the stacking of those structural characteristics, looking for that sweet spot. So where's the overlap between Backman sparrows and gopher tortoise? Where's the basal areas and canopy covers that we can get away with supporting, all of these species kind of at one time.
Slide.
Again, so we went through the literature review, a whole series of field-based discussions with local managers to kind of fine-tune and get the metrics kind of the way we thought they should be to meet reality.
Slide.
Those were then published in this document, Rapid Assessment Metrics to Enhance Wildlife Habitat and Biodiversity within Southern Open Pine Ecosystems. This is available on the East Gulf website, and I'll show you the link to that in a second. And so within that, there's a series of tables that kind of articulate those canopy metrics, or the structural metrics rather. And we did that for each of those southern pine systems. So this is where I was kind of hating Bob Ford there for a while, because I told him I'd do longleaf, and I didn't realize that longleaf was like 8 different systems. But anyway, so we did all of them.
Slide.
You drill in a little bit and look at those tables. So again, having instead of the forested wetlands had desired conditions and a trigger point, as in or out. Here in the pine systems, we kind of graded them: excellent, good, fair, and poor. This was playing off of some previous work by the Longleaf Partnership Council. Kind of this way the community was kind of headed, so we kind of played along with that one as well. So again, you should be able to go out and assess a condition, of a stand, look at your basal area of either pine or hardwoods, canopy cover, structure, etc., and kind of see where your stand falls on this matrix.
Slide.
There's an additional table that looks at ground layer, the dry music, and here we're just looking at dry music longleaf. Again, so, you can look at your stand, do an inventory. Yeah, I'm pretty good. I could do better over here. And hopefully this information allows you as that manager to determine the prescriptions that's warranted, whether it's a silvicultural treatment or, introducing, prescribed fire activities, etc.
Slide, table.
And so I need to move on because I'm kind of running out of time here. So moving on into kind of the decision-based monitoring aspect. So one of the beauties of, as I said on the front end, so these desired conditions, they've explicitly identified the structural metrics that we're worried about, and we've linked them to some wildlife species. And so by nature, it should inform how we move forward through designing our monitoring programs.
Slide.
And just kind of looking at some research and some of our existing monitoring. This is from forested wetlands in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. If you look at, this is captures per net hour from a MAP, Monitoring Avian Productivity Survivorship Protocol. For Swainson's warblers and hooded warblers, a couple of species that require kind of that dense, complex understory. We don't really see those species occur or start showing up till about year 7 or 8 post-treatment. And so we always make this point that if you just go out and do a treatment and you monitor a couple, 2 or 3 years after that treatment, you may not see the true treatment effect for your priority species unless you're carrying that monitoring out for numerous years.
Slide, several graphs.
And again, we see it also in some of our point count work. This is some work from Dan Tweet and Scott Summershoe. And all these graphs, the little dotted line is the controls. You can see there's winners and losers. For thonotary warblers and red-eyed vireos, don't really respond that well to our forest treatments. For thonotary, kind of makes sense, right? We're probably knocking down a lot of snags. Red eyes is a little mystery, but we're through some other work in the eastern hardwoods. Red eyes tend to like that closed canopy system, and so we're busting holes in the canopy. So it kind of goes without saying we should see a reduction there. For some of our other, priority birds, like Swainson's warblers, again, we're not seeing those really peak up in their abundance for those, 8-9 years post-treatment. And then there's, we can look at these. This data set only goes 13 or 14 years post-treatment. We can see a lot of these species start to tail off at about year 12 or 13. Again, it goes back to that evaluation cycle I was talking about. If we're losing those priority species at a year 12 or 13, we need to think about re-entering those stands or making sure that habitat's available somewhere on the landscape to keep those populations at those sustained levels.
Slide, graph.
We always get the question about nest success. Here's a pretty good example from the White River National Wildlife Refuge from Bob Cooper and his students, looking at prothonotary nest success, where we had a couple of years of pre-treatment data, followed by several years post-treatment. The take home here is notice how close everything's kind of grouped together. Every now and then they kind of spread out a little bit. The other point, the clear is the controls. Some years controls are higher, some years controls are in the middle, some years controls are lower. But the take home from all of this, almost 10 years of study, was in this system, there was no treatment effects related to the nest success. In that controls were higher 1 year, lower. That nest success is probably largely driven by other environmental things, weather conditions, insect outbreaks, etc. So we're not seeing any sort of treatment effects to the negative for nest success.
Slide, table.
So shifting gears a little bit, talking maybe more towards the forester side of the street here. So we have desired forest conditions identified. So if we have our stands delineated, then we should be able to evaluate those stands based off of these metrics to see kind of where maybe we need to work in the future as a means of prioritizing our work activities. And so here's an example. I think this is from White River National Wildlife Refuge, where we identified the stands. We did a complete inventory, and now we can see kind of those stands that are in target conditions, those that where we might warrant our management, and things that are kind of what we call neutral for now. They're okay. They're not too bad. And so this provides the forester on the ground some additional insight into where within his local landscape he might or she might be thinking about working.
Slide, bullet point list.
So kind of wrapping this up, in summary, we can kind of see the desired forest conditions. It identifies those species habitat relationships, makes it pretty explicit, facilitates forest inventory, provides a basis to assess our current conditions. So how much habitat do I have in good conditions now, which would allow us to do a little modeling as far as thinking about recovery of populations. It enables the development of management prescriptions at multiple spatial scales. So before it was just go cut some trees and I hope I get a bird response. And so now we've tied all that together so we can really fine tune our prescriptions. And so when the forester is sitting down thinking about how hard we need to cut a stand, we have some metrics to play off of. It also targets our research and monitoring activities, right? So now we have some very explicit assumptions of how birds are related to habitat, or bats and bears or other, trust resources as well. So it targets our research. And those of you that are familiar with the Mississippi Alluvial Valley and our forest habitat restoration activities, we know that Dan Tweet by name has spent an entire career helping us test assumptions and monitoring these sort of activities. And that's kind of what we need within the larger community, is those researchers really focusing on helping us understand these management actions as we put them on the ground. And then that last one, where I think I said this on the very front end, it requires an increased communication amongst the biologists, the foresters, and the administrators, right? The administrators have to give us the support to put everybody in the room together. But it's really, it's down to the biologists and the foresters having a one-on-one relationship and being able to talk, hey, I want to implement this. What do you think about it? How's those DFCs help me do this? So it's really calls for that co-production sort of environment.
Slide, bullet point list.
So in closing, I spoke about Dan Tweet a second ago. I'll give him a ton of credit here. So Dan's retired now, but right before he retired, he did kind of a comprehensive literature review of, how is forest management benefiting our bird communities. And what he found in this kind of comprehensive review was that our bird populations are really benefiting from what he called a retention harvest within our forest. So we're not clear cutting, we're retaining some level of standing stock within our systems. There was positive conservation effects that may last out to 20 years for some of these species. And that within our hardwood stands, that our avian response was greatest when we retained 30 to 50% of that stand. So we're not taking it to the ground, liquidating the whole stand. It's some sort of an intermediate, a variable retention sort of harvest. And then within our conifer stands, the retention of 50 to 70%, where we're kind of seeing the greatest avian response. So as someone who's kind of worked in forest management arenas for almost 20 years, this was really positive that we're actually getting to the point where we can link the birds to the habitat, put the treatments on the ground, and we can actually document that we're seeing positive benefits on the backside.
Slide, table, and map.
And so with that, I just remind folks that, as we get into this new paradigm, so population sustainability, we have to think about both the landscape and the site quality within these systems that we're working in.
Slide.
And for more information, on the different DFCs that I presented here, the bottomland hardwoods can be obtained from the Lower Miss Joint Venture website. And also put the coordinator, Keith McKnight's email here. And then the Southern Pine DFCs are available on the East Gulf Coastal Plain Joint Ventures website, or you can contact Catherine Rideout, the coordinator there, for more information, or you can contact myself. And so with that, Jeff, I think I'm done, and I'll be glad to take a couple more questions as time permits.
Hey, Randy. So I would have never thought you would have gotten through 62 slides and only 30 minutes. So you did great. So hey, there's a lot of good questions here, and I really appreciate you kind of really laying out that context between the landscape quality and the site quality. So I'm going to start with some of the bigger picture questions. And so since you kind of ended on the population sustainability, and I'm going to Mark had a question. Considering the timeline showing evolution through ecosystem management into population sustainability, do you foresee a future phase beyond population sustainability? I'm sure Mark is considering we're going to be very successful in the population sustainability realm.
That's an excellent question. I guess I haven't thought about the next iteration, but my short answer is there almost has to be something next, right? And so there's the old cliche that to see where you're going, you need to see the past, right? You need to be able to see the history. And so we see each of the lessons learned through those different levels of changing paradigms and how conservation has progressed. You know, as we get into, renewable energy and climate change and how all of that works together, and especially climate, how it's impacting our changing forest. And we had a really nice presentation on that a couple of webinars previous. Somewhere in there is probably the next fine-tunement of population sustainability is factoring in climatic factors, be my guess. I'm just speculating on that one.
No, that's good. And again, there's a lot of good questions in here. And some of these questions, as I mentioned earlier, Randy's going to take a shot at answering some of these, and we'll send those answers back to everyone later. And some are better off because they'll have research links and such. And again, they're not meant to be dissertations on these questions, but a quick answer. But anyway, this one I think is still at that higher level, Randy. So this is from Jared. And this maybe goes back to some of our organic, and it's still in the objectives range. So here it is. In addition to species diversity, is thought given to other objectives, such as managing for functional diversity, ecosystem services, evolutionary history, etc.
Yes, and so that stays within the holistic framework of that ecosystem management paradigm, right? So we're managing our forest benefit birds, but we cannot ignore the other ecological processes, carbon flow, thinking about carbon sequestration efforts, hydrology events, changing water tables, and so forth. And so that's where the manager has to be in tune with the other, disciplines in that area, to factor in everything so that you have the complete picture and we're not just operating in a vacuum kind of with blinders on. Thinking about forest management and birds. And then also one step further, it's also linking that to the commercial activities related to the timber harvest, right? And so the commercial viability, timber markets, global markets, how all of that impacts how you do business, which gets you back into some climate, modeling efforts at a more broader scale. So yes, it all should be factored in and considered. I didn't want to paint the picture that we're just thinking about, trees and birds here.
Great. No, that's great. So now I'm going to read a couple questions that are really getting down into some detail. So this one's from Carl, and so he's saying, okay, in a forest with 60 to 70 square feet of basal area, that can't be related to 60 to 70% canopy without some measure of tree size, such as average diameter. But there is no metric for tree size. So how do you reconcile this?
Yeah, and I have to go find the table. It's basal area and canopy. Yeah, it's a
function.
It's a hard one to explain without like a whiteboard. So I really want my whiteboard. Yeah, it's a really good question, right? So you could have, a handful of trees of great big diameter size and eats up all your, your sunlight. So we tried to address that. There's one of the metrics. There's a stand index and there's a basal area. I'm trying to visualize the table. But Carl, we need to probably talk offline and phone one with the true answer because it relies on so many different understandings of the other metrics.
Now so it sounds like
let me
Carl's
follow up with Carl offline on that one.
Yeah, so Carl's going to get a graph for his birthday.
That's right.
So all right, and so here's another one that's pretty technical as well. This one's from Bill Vogel, and so are you incorporating skips, areas that are not treated, within the treated stands to create spatial diversity at a smaller than stand level scale? And I guess that's back to objectives, but I'll let you take that away.
I can answer that one. So the short answer is yes, we do factor those in. And so typically what our normal quote unquote silvicultural treatment is what we refer to as a variable retention thinning. And so as we're walking through the stand, as we're marking, we come to a patch, this looks good. I don't know what I could do to improve this little area right here. It might be a half acre, it might be 2 acres. We might just walk right through that and not even mark a tree. So that embeds some of that in-stand diversity that the person was asking about. So yes, we definitely do that. We factor that in.
All right, so here's one I think that works pretty well for the discussion, for instance, of the open pine systems. And I thought that was a great point where you showed for one system where you had, basically there were 8 presentations of that system on the landscape. And so this maybe fits into that. So how important, the question is, this is from Eli, how important is it to capture ground cover parameters in this framework? What types of ground cover metrics do you think are the most important and informative?
Yeah, and so here, maybe within the pine systems, I don't think we even did it there. We stopped short of identifying like species composition as far as, the key metrics. The key metric was we need ground cover, right? And so like grasses and forbs. In the pine systems, those are your native warm season grasses and forbs. In the forested wetlands where it's more wet, it's not so much grassy, it's more just the dense understory cover. And so it's not that the species composition is likely going to change based off of where you are, within that system. So that's why we stopped short of trying to tell the manager you should have X, Y, and Z in your composition. Right? That's for the local manager. What we were trying to iterate is that here's the good and the bad cut points for having ground cover, and if that makes sense. I'm not sure I answered the question.
I think you did. So here's a simpler question. Are there similar DFCWs available for northern hardwoods or oak hickory forests? And that question's from Peter.
Okay. So I'm pretty sure that the Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture Partnership has something very similar to desired forest conditions for that geography. I know the folks further north in the Northeast were working on some similar sort of metrics. They may not have called them desired forest conditions. There was an attempt to kind of relate, the priority birds to structural metrics. So there are a few things out there. Just given on the time constraints, I focused on the 2 that I was most familiar with, but I'm pretty sure that the Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture Partnership has some of these as well.
No, that's great. I'm having fun looking. So there's some good questions in here for you, Randy. And some are asking for a link to the Southern Pine Forest DFC. So you may have to. I don't have that handy. So here's one, Randy, from Jonathan. When looking at retention, did you find significant differences in distribution of retained trees as opposed to just percent retained?
He returns to the information slide.
So the difference in distribution, are we referring to like size classes or?
Yeah, I am not sure. Did you find? I'll read it one more time and see if we can determine that. When looking at retention, did you find significant differences in distribution of retained trees? And then it says, as opposed to just percent retained. So, that could be relation to species distribution, or I'm not sure I can help you.
Yeah, and so it's hard to answer that one without a little bit more specifics, but normally, it's up to that local manager as you're marking timber, the stand, like there's some places where, sweet pecan is, a keep. So the distribution would have way more sweet potatoes in the keep category than we would going on the truck to the mill. In other cases, there was really no real rule sets on diameters or anything as far as that goes. And then the spatial distribution of them, it was kind of how the chips would fall, right? So we marked them as we saw them going through the stand. And so it would be interesting to go back and look at it. It'd be a spatial exercise to see if the spatial distribution of trees mattered in that retention. But I don't think we've addressed that one per se.
Okay, and so I think there's time for one more, Randy. And again, you've done a nice job of answering these, and the presentation was great. So this one's from Brenda, and again, this is a question we're seeing more and more. I mean, this is relevant to our times. So your management actions impose a disturbance that reduces stand biomass for a short while, much as many natural disturbances do. How do you balance treatments such as these with carbon sequestration and storage, now that we have to consider carbon storage?
Right, and that's an excellent question. And we're still lacking in some research on that. The early research that I saw back in the first time we talked, about 10 years ago, we talked about carbon storage. It was the hot topic, and then it kind of went away, went out of vogue for about 8 or 10 years, and now it's back. And so, yes, we are reducing standing stock, but those trees that are released or retained, released to grow a bit more vigorously. So there was some early research showing that they sequestered, additional carbon above what they would have if they had been just, competing, with their neighbor. And so there is some offset in that. The real issues get into the carbon leakage in the whole market system. Once it leaves the stand, it goes on the truck. Is it really stored? If it goes into furniture or something, or desk, yep, it's locked up. Or if it's used for firewood, then it goes right back in the system, and it goes the other direction. So the carbon market and understanding the principles of that is pretty complicated. But there was some early research, and I haven't kept up with the carbon research, to be honest, here recently, was that the increased growth rates and yields of the retained trees was offsetting some of that loss in the biomass. And then it went into the larger carbon market to figure out if you were actually a net loss or gain.
No, that's great. So, Randy, that was a great presentation. And, again, you did a great job of showing the context between, the landscape quality and the site quality, and how nicely they were linked. And so I'll just remind folks that moves us, we're still trying to tell one story about, forest for the birds. And so these last discussions have been really on the landscape to stand, that kind of in that area. But now we're going to start talking a little bit more about conservation initiatives in our next webinar. And so I just wanted to remind folks that on September 21st, we're going to have talk about forestry for the birds. So a number of the programs that are out there, these are more state-focused programs, and our speaker is going to be Amanda Mahaffey from the Forest Stewards Guild. And I just wanted to thank Randy Wilson one more time for a really great presentation. And I will also remind folks that under webinar 4, there's also the 6-minute video on some of the stuff happening in the Mississippi alluvial valley. So again, thanks, Randy, for a great presentation, and thanks for all the participants. You guys really make this for us, and we'll try to send out answers to the other questions we couldn't get to today within the next couple of weeks. So be looking in your email. And thanks to everyone. And again, big thanks to you, Randy, and thanks to Shannon. Thanks, everyone.